Hi, this is Dr. P to talk about some flaws in tabletop game design. Now, I'm not going to try to list them all. It's just some that are fairly obvious. Many of these occur only in games for more than two sides, so you have to take that into account. And they also only occur in games that are highly interactive, unlike your typical Euro-style board game, which are parallel competitions. And some of these apply to video games, some do not. And here's a list of the flaws. I don't know how many I've got. There's no particular order. The first of these is a dominant strategy. This is a strategy that you must follow to succeed in a game. Unless everybody's a poor player, of course. We expect that a puzzle will have a dominant strategy, that is, an always correct solution. Though some puzzles have several solutions, in essence, parallel competition games are puzzles with multiple dominant strategies. And whoever executes the dominant strategy best will likely win the game. In an opposed game where players can strongly influence one another, a dominant strategy is a disaster. That can be true even in a two-player game. For example, A Few Acres of Snow, a game by a very well-known designer, but there was a flaw in it such that one side had a strategy that always worked. Well, the rules could be changed to mostly fix that, although every once in a while, still, one side was able to execute that strategy. Another problem is leader bashing, where players easily and typically gang up on the leader. So this is a game for more than two sides. And they do that to the point that no one wants to be the leader. And if it's too easy to see who is in the lead, it's more likely to happen. And if it's too easy to play against the leader, it's likely to happen. And so combine those things together and leader bashing is likely to happen. So you can see how to counteract it. For example, it doesn't happen in many parallel competitions because it's very hard to play against the other players. Another way is if scoring happens at different speeds or intervals for different players. That kind of obscures who's ahead, as in my game Britannia. Another problem is a premature conclusion or climax. If the game is practically over well before it actually ends, that's a premature climax. Why waste the player's time going further? Sometimes this is quite obvious and players cannot avoid it. Sometimes it's not. For example, I had a prototype for 2 to 8 players and it was almost always played by at least 4. I tracked who was ahead, and it turned out that whoever was ahead halfway through the game usually won, even though there were lots of players. So I had to change the game significantly to fix that. To me, that was a flaw. Nobody else noticed it, but I did. Another problem is unnecessary or trivial stuff that the players are stuck doing. This wastes their time and it usually isn't fun. For example, record keeping can often be avoided. You as the designer have to decide what's important and what's not. If something isn't a necessary part of succeeding in the game, get rid of it or automate it. And of course, this is much easier with a video game than with a tabletop game. Sometimes you have a game where what happens doesn't justify the length of the game. The game may be so short that players wish it would continue. That is, the interest of the content is greater than the length allows it to be displayed. But much more likely, the game may be longer than the value of the content, longer than is worthwhile. Playtesting should sort this out as long as you're willing to cut things out of the game or otherwise adjust it possibly drastically. Another problem is not enough stages in the game. When you have a change from one stage to another, the nature of the play changes. Players have to think about new problems and new occurrences. If a game is quite short, it may have only one stage. A long game should have several stages, or it will likely be tedious. That's perhaps a contrast to video games, where you have a loop that players really enjoy, like shooting, and they'll just do it over and over and over for hours. Clearly, this is related strongly to the previous point of a game being appropriate length. You have to have appropriate number of stages as well as an appropriate length. Kingmaking or petty diplomacy is a problem. In some games for 3 players, or that have reduced to 3 players, one player thinks they have lost, they are often able to determine which of the others wins. It's all called kingmaking. This can be difficult to avoid, but it should be avoided. I wrote a long essay about the problem for the free online book, Tabletop Analog Game Design 2011, which can be downloaded at the URL that's on the screen. Another flaw is follow the leader. In some games, especially parallel competitions where there are several dominant strategies, it can make sense for players to take the same actions as someone who is in the lead. Now, this makes for a boring game, doesn't it? Evidently, the game lacks sufficient variety. Or worse, it has just a single dominant strategy which everyone is following. Turtling is a common problem. And again, this only occurs in games for more than 2 players. If it's a viable strategy in a conflict game to sit and stay out of the conflict, which is called camping in video games, then that's a problem. And the designer has to fix it so that's not a viable strategy. I've talked about that at more length elsewhere. Sandbagging. In some games for more than 2 players, it is undesirable to be in the lead late in the game. Usually games that allow a lot of leader bashing too. So players tend to gang up on the leader at that point late in the game, and that lets somebody else win the game. The leader is doomed. So people sandbag, pretend they are less successful or less powerful than they really are, or deliberately make sure they are not as powerful as they could be. This is, in some extent, a natural part of multiplayer games. For example, you watch a Britannia game, frequently the players will be telling everyone else why they are not ahead and someone else is. But in the extreme, for example in the game Winky, or Vinci as it's often pronounced, sandbagging is undesirable. The gentleman's fallacy. A designer cannot say, "That's not how I wanted it played." A game is played according to what the rules say, not according to what the designer intended. Some people will play in accordance with the rules if it gives an advantage, regardless of the spirit of the game or sportsmanship, and they're not wrong. The rules are the game. If you don't follow the rules, you're playing a different game. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as long as everyone agrees ahead of time to play a different game than the game that's expressed in the rules. Bad luck or missing out. A player shouldn't have to depend heavily on a lucky chance in a skill-based game. For example, Mike Gray, who was at the time the Hasbro game acquisitions guy, told us about a game he pitched to Hasbro's committee that decided whether to move on with possibly publishing the game. It was a good game, but a player couldn't do much until a 50-50 chance went the player's way. During the pitch, Mike had to wait at least a dozen times to get the 50-50 his way, and that killed that game's chance of publication. The designer should have anticipated this would happen sometime and made sure to fix it. More missing out. I'm quoting somebody. In regular Settlers, a player can go 10 plus turns with no resources gained. I've gone up to 15 turns with nothing added to my hand, and of course lost the game due to this setback, because you need resources to build things. A roll of 2d6, the sum, determines the allocation of resources, and yes, you can get unlucky. The solution in Settlers America, a player who gets nothing gains a coin. Each turn, players can buy up to 2 resources a turn at a cost of 2 coins. In other words, a player always gets at least the equivalent of 1 resource and actually has more flexibility with the coin than with a resource because they can turn it into whatever resource they want. Settlers is another name for Catan, for those who are not familiar with the old name of the game, which was Settlers of Catan. Adding too much. What do you do when there's a problem with your design? Too many designers add something. Now, my motto is that a designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And another expression of this is make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. Simplify to solve problems. Don't add more stuff. Games can survive one of these flaws, sometimes more, but they shouldn't have to. Thanks for listening.